Before we descend into the shadows of 1982, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden histories of the Cold War and the secrets that lie beneath the surface of ordinary life, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring these forgotten archives to light. The London fog of November 1982 was not the romantic mist found in Victorian novels. It was a heavy chemical soup, a mixture of diesel fumes from the black cabs, coal smoke from the few remaining hearths in the East End, and the damp, bone-chilling breath of the River Thames. It clung to the wool coats of commuters rushing toward the tube stations, obscured the faceless, brutalist architecture of the South Bank, and provided the perfect cover for things that did not want to be seen. Arthur Penhaligon knew the fog better than most. For the better part of 3 years, Arthur had been a resident of the concrete alcove beneath the northern struts of Waterloo Bridge. At 64 years old, Arthur was a man who had been slowly erased by the city he once helped build. He was a former dock worker, a man whose hands were mapped with the scars of rough rope and rusted steel, a veteran of an industry that had packed up and moved to container ships and computerized logistics, leaving men like him behind. To the thousands of Londoners who walked past him every day on their way to the National Theatre or the offices of the Strand, Arthur was less than a person. He was a heap of rags, a smell of damp tweed and cheap cider, an obstacle to be stepped around. They did not look at his face, which was weathered and lined like an old road map. They did not see his eyes, which were a piercing, clear blue, undimmed by age or hardship. Arthur didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, he had learned to use it. When you are invisible, you can see everything. He spent his days sitting on a crate, his back against the damp stone of the embankment wall, watching the shoes of the passers-by. He learned that you could tell a man's life by his shoes, the polished, severe black Oxfords of the bankers from the city, always in a hurry, heels clicking a rhythm of anxiety, the scuffed, sensible boots of the laborers, heavy and slow, the worn-out trainers of the students, drifting without purpose. Arthur observed the rhythm of the city. He knew that the 5:15 p.m. train to Guildford was always late, causing a surge of angry commuters at 5:20. He knew that the police patrol, 2 bobbies, 1 young, 1 old, passed his alcove at 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. sharp unless it was raining, in which case they stayed in their warm car on the upper level. He knew the regulars, the lady in the red coat who dropped a sandwich in the bin near the railing every Tuesday, which Arthur retrieved once she was gone. It was usually egg and cress. The man with the limp who fed the pigeons on Thursdays. And then there was the gray man. Arthur had first noticed the gray man in early October. He didn't have a name for him then, just a designation based on his attire, a high-quality charcoal gray wool overcoat, perfectly tailored with a matching scarf and a trilby hat that seemed a decade out of fashion, but was worn with such confidence it didn't matter. The gray man didn't rush like the others. He walked with a precise, measured gait. He didn't look at the river. He scanned the pavement, the railings, the benches. He came every Wednesday at dusk, just as the street lamps were flickering to life, buzzing with that electric hum that signaled the end of the day. He wasn't a tourist. Tourists looked up at the skyline. He wasn't a commuter. Commuters looked at their watches. The gray man looked at the spaces between things. On this particular Tuesday in November, the fog was thicker than usual. The dampness seeped through the layers of newspaper Arthur had stuffed under his coat for insulation. He was shivering, rubbing his hands together to keep the circulation going, when he saw the familiar silhouette emerge from the gloom. The gray man. But it was Tuesday, not Wednesday. Arthur shifted on his crate. A break in the pattern. In Arthur's world, a break in the pattern usually meant trouble. It meant the police were doing a sweep, or the council was coming to wash down the pavement, or the local hooligans were looking for sport. He watched as the gray man stopped by the third bench from the bridge. A green-painted cast-iron seat dedicated to a Martha H. 1902-1978. The man didn't sit. He stood by the railing, staring out at the gray void of the Thames. He placed a leather briefcase on the bench. He took off his right glove. He adjusted his scarf. To anyone else, it was a man pausing for a moment of reflection. To Arthur, who had spent a lifetime watching cranes lift cargo with millimeter precision, it looked like a performance. The movements were too deliberate, too rehearsed. Arthur felt a cough building in his chest, a rattle of bronchitis he'd been fighting for weeks. He stifled it, not wanting to draw attention. He wanted to see what the gray man would do next. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He lit one, the flare of the match illuminating a face that was handsome, but utterly forgettable. Smooth skin, nondescript features, the kind of face that slid off your memory the moment you looked away. He took one drag, then let the hand holding the cigarette drop to his side. He turned his head left, then right. He was checking the perimeter. Arthur shrank back into the shadows of his alcove. He knew that look. It was the look of a man who had something to hide. And in 1982, in a city gripped by the paranoia of the Cold War, watching a man who wanted to be invisible was a dangerous game. But Arthur was bored, he was cold, and he was curious. He didn't know that the man standing 20 feet away was a colonel in the KGB's Directorate S, nor did he know that the briefcase on the bench contained the layout of the Royal Navy's new encrypted communication arrays. All Arthur knew was that the man's shoes, expensive, leather-soled, impeccably shined, didn't match the weather. No Londoner in their right mind wore leather soles on a wet embankment. You'd slip and break your neck. Arthur cleared his throat. Viktor Volkov, known to his colleagues at the Anglo-European Trade Association as Julian Thorne, did not like the fog. In Moscow, the cold was dry and honest. It bit your face and froze your breath, but it was clear. You could see who was coming. In London, the cold was wet and deceitful. It crept under your collar and into your bones. And the fog made surveillance a nightmare. Victor checked his watch. 5:43 p.m. He was 7 minutes early. He cursed silently. Punctuality was a virtue in a soldier, but a vice in a spy. Being early meant loitering. Loitering meant being remembered. He should have walked around the block one more time, but the package in his briefcase felt heavy, radioactive with the secrets it held. He had spent 5 years building the persona of Julian Thorne. He had a flat in Kensington, a membership at a squash club in Fulham, and a boring, mid-level job importing agricultural machinery components. He paid his taxes. He complained about the tube strikes. He drank warm beer and pretended to enjoy it. He was a masterpiece of the illegals program, a ghost in the machine. Tonight was a brush-pass drop, a high-risk maneuver he had been ordered to execute because the dead drop sites in Hampstead Heath had been compromised. His handler, a man he knew only as Paul, would walk past this bench at 5:50 p.m. Victor would leave the briefcase on the bench and walk away. Paul would sit down, wait 2 minutes, and leave with the case. Simple, dangerous, necessary. Victor took a drag of his cigarette. It was a Benson & Hedges, a British brand. He hated them. He missed the harsh, unfiltered bite of a Bellamorcanal, but he hadn't smoked one of those since 1977. He scanned the area. The embankment was mostly deserted. The fog kept the casual strollers away. A few cars hissed by on the road above, their headlights cutting yellow cones through the mist. There was a pile of rags under the bridge abutment. Victor had noted it during his reconnaissance. A homeless person. He had categorized the threat level as negligible. In Victor's training and in his experience of British society, the homeless were treated as non-entities. People looked through them, not at them. They were part of the scenery, like the lampposts or the bins. Furthermore, a man living in a box was unlikely to be a counterintelligence officer. MI5 agents complained about overtime. They didn't sleep in puddles of urine for the sake of a routine drop. Victor turned his back to the bridge. He focused on the river. He needed to calm his heart rate. The adrenaline was a chemical sharpener, but too much of it made your hands shake. He needed steady hands for the signal. He adjusted his scarf again, left hand over right shoulder. This was the safety signal. I am here. The coast is clear. Proceed. He heard footsteps approaching from the east, hard soles on wet pavement. He didn't turn. He listened. The cadence was right. A steady, purposeful walk. Not a wanderer, not a policeman. It was Paul. Victor prepared to move. He would take one last drag, drop the cigarette, crush it with his heel, and walk away toward the underground station, leaving the briefcase behind. He exhaled the smoke, watching it swirl into the gray dampness. "Excuse me, Gov." The voice was raspy, like gravel in a cement mixer. It came from behind him. Victor froze. His training screamed at him, do not react, ignore, walk away. But he couldn't walk away yet. Paul was 30 seconds away. If Victor left now, the timing would be off. If he ignored the voice, the man might get louder, drawing attention. Victor turned slowly, wearing the mask of polite annoyance that was the armor of the British middle class. The pile of rags had shifted. An old man was leaning forward on a crate, his face half hidden by a wool cap and a matted beard. His blue eyes were locked onto Victor. I said, excuse me, the man repeated. Victor looked at him, letting a flicker of disdain cross his face. I don't have any change, Victor said, his accent a perfect, clipped received pronunciation, cultivated by hours of listening to BBC Radio 4. I didn't ask for money, the man said. Victor felt a prickle of unease. This was off script. Homeless men asked for money or cigarettes or food. They didn't start conversations with, I didn't ask for money. Then what do you want? Victor asked, checking his watch again. 5:48 p.m. 2 minutes. The man pointed a gnarled finger at Victor's feet. I was just wondering, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conversational rumble. You waiting for the boat? Victor frowned. The boat? The ferry? Arthur said. To Woolwich. Victor's mind raced. He knew the map of London perfectly. He had memorized the A to Z guide. He knew the bus routes, the train lines, the tube stations. But ferries? That was a blind spot. There were tourist boats, yes, river buses. He made a split-second calculation. If he said yes, the man might keep talking about schedules. If he said no, the man might ask why he was standing by the railing in the rain. No, Victor said dismissively. Just getting some air. Right, Arthur said. He nodded slowly. Bit wet for air, innit? And your shoes. Victor looked down at his shoes. What about them? Leather soles, Arthur said. Slippery on the cobbles. You ain't from around here, are you? The question hit Victor like a physical blow. You ain't from around here. It was the one thing an illegal feared most, the unmasking, the realization that despite the accent, the clothes, the history, the documents, something deep inside them was foreign. Victor stiffened. I live in Kensington, he snapped. Now if you'll excuse me. He turned back to the river. He needed to terminate this interaction. Paul was coming. He could see the silhouette of his handler emerging from the fog 50 yards away. But Arthur wasn't finished. Arthur Penhaligon wasn't trying to catch a spy. He was just a bored old man who had noticed a discrepancy. When the gray man had said he lived in Kensington, Arthur believed him. The coat said Kensington. The attitude said Kensington. But the reaction to the question about the shoes, the defensive snap, the rigid posture, that didn't say Kensington, that said fear. And then there was the ferry question. Arthur had asked about the ferry to Woolwich as a joke. There hadn't been a ferry stop at this part of the embankment since 1954. The pier had been demolished before the Beatles released their first album. Anyone who had lived in London for more than a month would know that. You couldn't catch a boat from here if you wanted to. There was no gangway, just a sheer drop to the muddy water. A Londoner would have said, "There's no boat here, mate," or "You're daft." But the gray man had paused. He had processed the question as if it were a valid inquiry. He had checked his mental database and found a gap. He didn't know. Arthur scratched his beard. Why would a man in a Kensington coat stand in the freezing fog, terrified of an old tramp, and not know there was no pier? Arthur watched as another man approached, a walker in a beige trench coat. The walker was moving steadily toward the bench. The gray man was vibrating with tension. Arthur could see the muscles in his neck bunching above the scarf. He looked at the briefcase on the bench. Then he looked at the walker. Oh, Arthur thought. It's a meeting. It wasn't a romantic tryst. Too cold, no flowers. It wasn't a drug deal. These men were too clean, too old. It was business. But businessmen met in pubs or offices or clubs. They didn't meet on wet benches in the dark. Unless it was business they didn't want anyone to see. Arthur felt a sudden sharp clarity. He remembered the war. He remembered the blackout. He remembered the whispered conversations in the shelters. He knew that bad things happened in the dark. The walker, Paul, was 20 yards away. The gray man, Thorne, stepped away from the bench, leaving the briefcase. "You forgot your bag, Gov," Arthur called out, loudly. The sound echoed off the concrete bridge supports like a gunshot. Victor winced. He stopped mid-step. He couldn't leave the bag now. If he walked away after being told he'd forgotten it, it would look suspicious to anyone watching. And he had to assume someone was always watching. The walker, hearing the shout, didn't break stride. He kept walking, eyes forward, passing the bench without slowing down. He ignored Victor. He ignored the bag. He ignored Arthur. The handover was aborted. Victor stood frozen. The protocol was clear. If the pass is compromised, do not engage. Retain the package. Evacuate. He turned back to the bench, his face a mask of fury. He snatched up the briefcase. He marched over to Arthur's crate. He loomed over the sitting man, blocking out the dim light of the street lamp. "You," Victor hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You are a nuisance." "Just trying to help," Arthur said, holding his ground. He smelled the gray man's cologne now, expensive, musk and sandalwood, and something else. The smell of stale tobacco smoke on his wool, not the light, sweet smell of the cigarette he'd just smoked, a heavier, coarser smell. "Here," Victor said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a 5-pound note. A crisp, blue fiver, a fortune to a man like Arthur. Victor crumpled it and threw it at Arthur's chest. "Take it, and shut your mouth." Victor turned on his heel and walked away fast, heading for the stairs up to the bridge, his shoes clicking rapidly on the wet stone. Arthur picked up the note. He smoothed it out on his knee. The Queen stared back at him, stoic and regal. 5 pounds. He could eat for a week. He could get a bed in a hostel for 2 nights. He could buy a bottle of whiskey and forget the cold. But Arthur didn't put the money in his pocket. He stared at the gray man's retreating back. He threw it with his left hand. Arthur whispered to the empty air. The gray man had smoked with his right hand. He wore his watch, if he had one, on his left wrist, but he threw the money with his left. And the way he threw it, a backhanded flick, like he was discarding a shell casing. And the phrase, "You are a nuisance," not "you're a pain in the arse," not "bugger off." Nuisance. It was a formal word, a dictionary word. Arthur folded the 5-pound note carefully. He stood up, his knees cracked. He wrapped his ragged coat tighter around himself. He wasn't going to the hostel. He was going to follow the gray man. Following someone is an art form, and Arthur was an unlikely artist. He shuffled. He coughed. He moved with the slow, painful gait of the arthritic. But he had one advantage. The gray man wasn't looking for him. Spies look for other spies. They look for men in unmarked cars. They look for young, fit agents in denim jackets. They do not look for 60-year-old vagrants shuffling 300 yards behind them. Victor climbed the stairs to Waterloo Bridge. He was furious. The operation was burned. He would have to signal Paul later, set up a dead drop in a secondary location. The delay increased the risk. Every hour he held the documents was an hour he could be stopped, searched, discovered. He walked briskly across the bridge, the wind whipping his coat. He headed toward the Strand. He needed to get to a secure line. He needed to call the emergency number. He didn't notice the shambling figure reaching the top of the stairs behind him. Arthur kept his distance. He knew the route. The gray man was heading for a phone box. There was a row of red K6 telephone boxes near the Aldwych. Arthur's mind was working through the puzzle. The boat question. The leather soles. The nuisance. The left-handed throw. It reminded him of something. 1944. The docks. A crate of machinery that had come in from neutral Sweden. The paperwork said agricultural parts. But Arthur had lifted a crate, and the weight was wrong. It was too dense. He had told the foreman. The foreman told him to shut up. 2 days later, military police swarmed the warehouse. The crates contained tungsten. German tungsten. Something about the gray man's briefcase had looked heavy. When he picked it up, his shoulder dipped slightly. Just a fraction. Paper is heavy, but not that heavy. Victor reached the phone boxes. He chose the one on the far left. He stepped inside, the light turning on automatically. He placed the briefcase between his feet. Arthur stopped by a bus shelter 50 yards away. He pretended to rummage through a bin. He watched. Victor dialed. He spoke briefly. He hung up. He didn't put any money in. A reverse charge call or a signal code. Victor exited the booth. He looked around. He hailed a black cab. "Taxi!" The cab pulled over. Victor got in. The cab drove off, heading west. Arthur stood by the bin, defeated. He couldn't follow a taxi. He had £5, but a cabbie wouldn't take a man who smelled like the Thames. The trail was cold. Arthur sighed. He walked over to the phone box the gray man had just used. He didn't know why. Maybe he hoped the man had left a coin in the return slot. He stepped inside. The air still smelled of the man's cologne and that coarse, heavy tobacco. Arthur checked the coin return. Empty. He looked at the notepad shelf, that little metal ledge where people scribbled numbers. It was covered in graffiti. Call Tracy 4 a good time. Arsenal FC. But there, on the dusty glass next to the shelf, was a faint smudge. The condensation from the man's breath was fading, but in the dust, someone had traced a shape. Not a number. A shape. It looked like a triangle with a line through it. Arthur stared at it. It was probably nothing. A doodle while he waited for the connection. But then Arthur looked down at the floor of the booth. Something was stuck in the grating. A small blue piece of paper. Not money. A ticket. Arthur knelt down, his joints popping. He pried the paper out with a dirty fingernail. It was a dry cleaning receipt. Sketchley Cleaners. 14 High Street, Kensington. Order number 492. Items: 1 overcoat, wool. Date: 10 Nov 82. Arthur smiled, revealing his few remaining teeth. "Kensington," he muttered. "So you weren't lying about that." He put the receipt in his pocket next to the £5 note. He had a name, or at least an order number, and an address. Arthur Penhaligon was going to Kensington. Alara Vance sat at her desk in the sub-basement of Gower Street, rubbing her eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. Her desk was covered in transcripts from wiretaps that had yielded absolutely nothing. Alara was 26, a junior analyst for F Branch, subversion and counter-espionage. She was Oxford-educated, brilliant, and currently tasked with the most boring job in the service, monitoring the static. The static was the nickname for the endless stream of low-level noise that came from the Soviet embassy and known trade delegations. It was mostly mundane. Grocery lists, orders for office supplies, complaints about the weather. Her supervisor, a man named Henderson who still thought women belonged in the typing pool, had given her a stack of surveillance logs from the illegals watch list. These were people who might be spies, but probably weren't. She picked up a log from a surveillance team that had been trailing a suspected handler named Paul Gerasimov. Subject: Gerasimov Paul. Date: 16 Nov 82. Location: South Bank, Waterloo. Activity: subject walked from National Theatre to Hungerford Bridge. Did not stop. Did not engage. Notes: subject appeared to ignore a disturbance on the embankment involving a vagrant. Ilara paused. A disturbance involving a vagrant. She checked the cross-reference logs. Was there anyone else in the area? There was no active surveillance on anyone else near Waterloo that evening. But Gerasimov was a creature of habit. If he was walking the embankment in the fog, he was working. He didn't take scenic strolls. If he was working, he was meeting someone. If he didn't stop, the meeting was aborted. Why was it aborted? The disturbance. Ilara picked up the phone. She dialed the number for the surveillance team leader, a gruff man named Miller. "Miller!" the voice barked. "Sir, it's Vance in analysis. Regarding the Gerasimov log from last night." "What about it?" "The disturbance with the vagrant." "Can you elaborate?" Miller sighed. "Just some old tramp shouting. Gerasimov walked right past. We didn't engage because we didn't want to burn the follow." "What did the tramp shout?" Ilara asked. "I don't know, Vance. Something about a bag. We were 50 yards back in a van. The audio is garbage." "Do we have photos?" "It was foggy as pea soup. We have grainy shots of Gerasimov's back." "Did you see who the tramp was shouting at?" There was a pause on the line. "There was a civilian standing by the bench," Miller said slowly. "Male, Caucasian, overcoat. We assumed it was just a bystander being hassled for change. When Gerasimov walked past, the civilian left the scene quickly. Alara sat up straighter. Did you follow the civilian? No. Our target was Gerasimov. We stuck with the target. Alara closed her eyes. Standard procedure, but wrong. If Gerasimov walked past a man standing at a prearranged spot because of a shout, that man wasn't a bystander. That man was the contact. Describe the civilian, Alara said. Average height, gray coat, hat, looked like a city type. And the tramp? Just a tramp. Old, beard, probably lives under the bridge. Alara thanked him and hung up. She stared at the wall. A Soviet handler aborts a meet because a homeless man shouts at the contact. The contact flees. The homeless man is the only witness to the face of a deep cover illegal that MI5 doesn't know exists. Alara grabbed her coat. She wasn't authorized to run field ops. She was an analyst. But Henderson was at lunch, and the rules were meant to be bent. She was going to Waterloo. It is a long walk from Waterloo to Kensington, about 4 miles. For a young man, it's an hour's brisk stride. For Arthur, with his bad hip and fluid-filled lungs, it was a pilgrimage. He took the bus for part of it, risking the wrath of the driver, but was kicked off near Hyde Park Corner for smelling up the carriage. He walked the rest. The rain had started again, a cold drizzle that slicked the streets. Arthur reached Kensington High Street at 2 p.m. on Wednesday. He looked out of place among the boutiques and the polished storefronts. Shoppers in furs and expensive raincoats gave him a wide berth. A policeman eyed him suspiciously from across the street. Arthur found number 14, Sketchley Cleaners. It was a clean, brightly lit shop with rows of plastic-wrapped clothes revolving on a mechanical rack. Arthur stood outside, peering through the glass. He checked the receipt again. Order 4092. He couldn't just walk in and ask for it. They'd call the police. He needed a plan. He waited. He watched customers go in and out. A woman with a poodle, a man in a chauffeur's uniform. Finally, the shop emptied. The girl behind the counter, a teenager with chewing gum and bored eyes, turned her back to sort some shirts. Arthur pushed the door open. The bell chimed. He stepped inside, trying to look as small as possible. He took off his hat, wringing it in his hands. "Excuse me, miss," he rasped. The girl turned around. Her eyes widened in disgust. "We don't give handouts. Out." "I'm not begging, miss," Arthur said, holding up the blue slip of paper with a trembling hand. "I was sent to pick up an order for Mr. Thorne." He had guessed the name was fake, or at least common, but he hoped the ticket number was enough. He didn't actually know the name on the order. The receipt only said the number. He took a gamble. "My master, he's ill, you see. Sent me. I do the gardens." It was a terrible lie. Arthur looked like he lived in the garden, not tended it. The girl looked at the ticket. She looked at Arthur. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to breathe the air he was occupying. She just wanted him gone. "Ticket!" she snapped, snatching it from his hand with 2 fingers, careful not to touch his skin. She turned to the rack. She punched in a number. The mechanism whirred. A line of clothes danced by. It stopped. She pulled down a gray wool coat wrapped in plastic. "It's paid for," she said. "Take it and go." Arthur took the hanger. The coat was heavy. It was the same coat. He recognized the buttons. "Thank you, miss. You're an angel." He backed out of the shop, clutching the plastic-wrapped coat like a holy relic. He hurried down the street, turning into the first alleyway he could find. He crouched behind a dumpster. He tore the plastic open. He searched the pockets. Empty. He checked the inside pocket. Empty. He felt the lining. He pinched the fabric, moving his fingers inch by inch. Nothing. Arthur felt a wave of foolishness. What did he expect? A map to the Kremlin sewn into the collar. It was just a coat. The man had cleaned it because it was dirty. He sat back against the brick wall, the expensive coat draped over his knees. He was tired. He was hungry. And now he was a thief. He closed his eyes. Then his hand brushed against the bottom hem of the coat. It felt stiff. Arthur opened his eyes. He lifted the hem. The stitching was perfect, invisible. But there was something between the layers of wool and silk lining. a strip of something flat and flexible. Arthur felt along the hem. There was a tiny gap in the stitching near the vent at the back. He worked his finger into the gap. He pulled. A small microdot transparency? No, that was the movies. It was a key, a small, flat, silver key, the kind you use for a locker or a strong box. It had a number stamped on it, L24, and on the other side, a logo, a stylized lion. Arthur stared at the lion. He knew that logo. He had seen it 1,000 times in his youth. Waterloo Station, left luggage. The gray man didn't just have a coat cleaned, he was using the receipt as a reminder, or maybe the coat itself was a storage device for the key. Who checks the hem of a coat at the dry cleaners? Arthur held the key up to the rain. L24, he whispered. He had to go back to Waterloo. But as he stood up, a shadow fell over him. He looked up. Standing at the mouth of the alley was the gray man, and this time he was holding a suppressed pistol. "You," Victor said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You have been very, very persistent.